Most people think Samson lost his strength when Delilah cut his hair. He didn't. By the time she reached for the scissors, the real damage had already been done. The haircut didn't cause his downfall. It exposed it.
Welcome to Revelation Now, where faith meets real life, and every story reveals God's truth, hope, and purpose.
Thousands of years later, one of the greatest footballers in the world believed the exact same lie. He had the career, the money, the trophies, the admiration of millions. Then one ordinary moment took it all apart. What he discovered afterwards completely changed the general perspective on Samson's story. And once you see it, you'll never read Judges 16 the same way again. Atlas thought this would be the greatest night of his life. Looking back, it was the night everything began to fall apart. He just didn't know it yet. At 23 years old, Atlas had everything. The career, the money, the trophies, the admiration of millions. So why wasn't it enough? Nobody would have asked that question, because from the outside, his life looked perfect. In less than 2 hours, he'd have the chance to become the highest goal scorer in his club's history. The city had been talking about it all week. Fans and his teammates expected history. Even Atlas expected history. But history has a funny way of arriving. Sometimes it gives you exactly what you wanted. Other times, it reveals what you've actually been living for. Atlas looked relaxed, confident, like a man who'd been here 100 times before, and in many ways he had. Pressure didn't scare him anymore. It reminded him who he was. That should have been the first warning, because somewhere along the way, football had stopped being something he loved. It had become the place he went to discover his value. He never would have admitted that. He probably never even realized it. The evidence was everywhere. A good match could lift his mood for days. A bad one stayed with him all week. Praise made him feel alive. Criticism felt personal. If Atlas played well, he was enough. If he didn't, who was he? Football started as a game. Somewhere along the way, it became much more than that. Success came quickly. One season became 2. Then came the trophies, the interviews, the expectations. The higher he climbed, the harder it became to imagine life without it. His faith drifted in much the same way. He still believed in God. He still thanked him for every victory. From the outside, nothing seemed different. But faith rarely disappears all at once. It drifts. One postponed prayer, one excuse, until one day you don't even notice what's sitting on the throne of your heart. Atlas certainly didn't. He stood, pulled on his shirt, took one last look toward the tunnel. Everything he'd spent his life chasing was waiting on the other side. The roar of the crowd echoed through the concrete walls. History was only 90 minutes away. Atlas smiled. He believed this was the moment he'd been preparing for his entire life. He was right, just not in the way he expected. The injury wasn't the moment that broke Atlas. It simply revealed the cracks that had been there all along. 3 days later, the doctor confirmed it. 9 months, maybe longer. Atlas nodded. He thanked the doctor, shook his hand, walked out of the room. It was only when he reached the car that the weight of those words finally landed. 9 months doing what? For years, his life had answered that question before he even had to ask it. Wake up, train, recover, play, repeat. Now there was no schedule waiting for him. No teammates, no match to prepare for, no reason to rush. The first morning at home, his alarm rang at 6. His hand reached for the phone automatically. Then he stopped. There was nowhere to be. He turned the alarm off and lay there, listening to the silence. It was unfamiliar. Not because the apartment was quiet, because his mind wasn't. He tried filling the day, made coffee, left it untouched. turned on the television, muted it, opened his Bible, closed it again. Hours passed. Nothing held his attention. His knee wasn't what kept him restless. His thoughts did. Without football, the questions came quickly. Questions he'd managed to outrun for years. Who am I when nobody expects anything from me? Who am I when I can't do the one thing I've always done? He hated those questions, mostly because he didn't have an answer. His phone buzzed almost every hour. Praying for you. You'll come back stronger. We believe in you. Atlas smiled at every message, then set the phone down. Something about them felt incomplete. Everyone was talking about getting him back onto the pitch. Nobody was asking who he was without it. That thought wouldn't leave him. A week later, he watched his team play. He lasted one half. Not because they were losing. They weren't. Not because someone replaced him. That was inevitable. He switched the television off because something suddenly became impossible to ignore. The game didn't need him. It never had. By the next morning, the stadium had moved on. The headlines had moved on. The conversation had moved on. Only Atlas hadn't. He wandered into the room where he'd kept every trophy he'd ever won. League titles, golden boots, Player of the Year awards. For years, those shelves had answered every doubt he ever had. Now they were just objects, completely unable to answer the one question that mattered. If all of this can disappear, what exactly have I spent my life building? He stood there for a long time, not looking at the trophies, looking through them. For the first time in years, Atlas stopped asking when he'd get football back. He started asking why losing it felt like losing himself. He didn't know it yet, but that question would eventually lead him back to a story he'd heard as a child. A story about a man who also thought he'd lost his strength, when in reality, he'd lost something much deeper long before that. Questions have a way of following you. Ignore them and they'll wait. Distract yourself and they'll only grow louder. Atlas tried both. Neither worked. He stopped watching football, stopped reading the headlines, stopped pretending he was okay. Nothing quieted his mind. One afternoon, while searching for pain medication, he found a small Bible tucked away in the back of a cupboard. The same one his dad had given him years ago. Inside the cover were the words he'd written the day he left home. Don't forget where your gifts came from. Atlas stared at the page. Somehow, he'd carried that Bible across countries without ever letting it change him. The next morning, he picked it up again. Not because he suddenly had faith, because he'd run out of answers. His eyes wandered through the pages. Nothing. Another page. Still nothing. Then, one sentence stopped him. Not because he'd never read it before, because he'd somehow spent his whole life reading past it. He did not know that the Lord had left him. Atlas read it again. Then, once more. He couldn't move on. One question echoed in his mind. How does someone lose the presence of God and not even realize it's happened? He closed the Bible. But the verse refused to leave him. It followed him into the next day. And the day after that. For the first time, Atlas stopped asking, why did this happen to me? He started asking, what is God trying to show me through this? And maybe, for the first time in years, he was finally ready to hear the answer. The answer wasn't hidden. Atlas had simply never looked closely enough. He kept reading. Then he saw it. Not something new. Something he'd somehow missed his entire life. Samson didn't lose everything in a single night. He drifted there. One compromise, one distraction. By the time Delilah reached for the scissors, the real damage had already been done. Atlas sat back. His thoughts drifted through the last few years, not through the trophies, or the interviews, or the applause, through the quieter moments, the prayers he'd postponed, the time with God he'd promised himself he'd make later, the Bible he'd carried everywhere but rarely opened. Football always had an answer. When he doubted himself, there was another match, another goal, another headline, another reason to believe he was enough. Without realizing it, he'd spent years asking football questions only God was meant to answer. Then it hit him. Samson's story was never about hair. It never had been. The haircut revealed what had already happened long before anyone picked up the scissors. His injury had done exactly the same thing. It hadn't stolen his identity. It had exposed where he'd been looking for it. Different century, different gift, same lie. As long as the gift was still there, he assumed everything else was too. But gifts make terrible foundations. The moment they're asked to carry the weight of your identity, they eventually collapse beneath it. Atlas lowered his head. For years, he'd prayed for stronger performances, for protection from injuries, for bigger opportunities. Now his prayer sounded completely different. God, I don't want my career back. If I come back as the same man, bring me back to you first. That prayer didn't heal Atlas's knee overnight. It didn't erase months of rehabilitation. It didn't suddenly make life easy again. Recovery was still slow. But something else had changed. Football no longer had the final word on who he was. For the first time in years, his peace didn't depend on the next match. Eventually, Atlas returned to the pitch. The headlines celebrated the comeback. The fans welcomed their hero home. But that wasn't the greatest comeback of his life. The greatest comeback happened months earlier, when he stopped asking football to tell him who he was. Maybe that's why Samson's story still matters. Not because most of us will ever lose our hair or become professional athletes, but because every one of us has something we're tempted to build our identity on. Maybe for you, it isn't football. Maybe it's your career, your business, your relationship. None of those things are bad. They're gifts. But gifts make terrible foundations when they're carrying a weight they were never meant to bear. Careers end, money disappears, people leave. The question isn't whether those gifts matter. The question is, what happens when they're gone? Would you still know who you are? Maybe that's the real reason Samson's story was written. Not to warn us about Delilah, but to warn us what happens when we slowly drift from the one who gave us the gifts in the first place. So let's leave you with one question. What are you asking a gift to do that only the giver can?